I felt an undeniable sense of satisfaction as I handed my unfaithful wife the divorce papers. Now she's jobless, alone, and desperate to talk. I still remember the exact moment I noticed the first crack in our marriage. It was a quiet afternoon when I walked into the room and saw her laughing at something on her phone. The second she noticed me, she turned the screen away. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to lodge itself in my mind like a fracture in the foundation of our home. Keeping my voice steady, I asked casually, "Who was that?" She barely hesitated. "Just a client from the office," she said with a delayed smile, just a fraction of a second too late. Laurel, my wife, had spent 7 years climbing the corporate ladder at her marketing firm, rising from junior copywriter to creative director. Her talent, charisma, and relentless determination had propelled her forward. I once admired her ambition, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about her campaigns, the passion in her voice as she perfected presentations late into the night. I understood that her job demanded time, that our weekend plans would sometimes be postponed, our dinners interrupted by urgent emails. I accepted it. But lately, something had changed. The long nights at the office became more frequent. And then, the excuses started multiplying. Her usual stories about work became vague and generic, always describing the same old chaos, the usual office struggles. But something felt off. She'd quickly divert the conversation, suddenly overly interested in my architecture projects, asking questions with a rehearsed enthusiasm that felt more like a tactic to change the subject than genuine concern. If my suspicions were wrong, I would be relieved. But if they were right, I needed to know, no matter how much it hurt. So I became something I never thought I would be, a detective in my own marriage. The first step was the hardest, crossing that line, breaking the trust we had built over the years. But once I did, something in me shifted. A colder, more analytical side took over. This wasn't just my marriage anymore. It was a case, and I needed evidence. I started small. Using a favor from a tech-savvy client, I installed tracking software on our shared computer. It wasn't long before patterns emerged. Laurel left the house every morning at 7:30 a.m., returning around 7 p.m., but the data told a different story. She often stayed in the office building long after hours, or was in places that had nothing to do with work. Then came the final proof. One Tuesday evening, she texted me, "Working late on a presentation. Don't wait up." But the tracker showed something else entirely. That night, she wasn't at the office. She was at Del Meridian, a boutique downtown hotel. She came home at 11:30 p.m. that night, her hair slightly damp, a faint trace of perfume lingering on her skin. "Went to the gym after work," she said casually, tossing her bag on the couch. I just nodded, suppressing the bile rising in my throat. The lies were getting bolder, and I was done pretending not to see them. A deeper dive into our credit card statements painted an even clearer picture. Transactions at restaurants I didn't recognize. Business lunches, she claimed. Small boutique purchases near her office, including lingerie I had never seen her wear. Her phone, however, was a fortress. She guarded it obsessively, keeping it with her at all times, even bringing it to the bathroom. But one morning, while she was in the shower, I saw my chance. Using her birth date, the simple passcode she had never bothered to change, I unlocked it. What I found shattered any lingering doubt. Hundreds of messages with Vincent. At first, they were work-related. But then, the tone shifted. Flirtation, innuendos, then explicit exchanges. Arrangements for meetings that had nothing to do with marketing, and photos. I couldn't look for more than a second before nausea hit me. Silently, I forwarded the damning evidence to my own email, then placed the phone exactly where I had found it. The shower was still running, and over the sound of the water, I could hear her humming a tune, a song I didn't recognize. It was almost laughable. She was happy. But I wasn't done. The final confirmation came when I decided to follow her. That evening, I told her I had a family emergency and left early. Instead of going home, I parked outside her office at 5:30 p.m. and waited. At exactly 6:07 p.m., I watched her step out of the building, and she wasn't alone. She wasn't alone. Accompanied by a tall man in an expensive suit, there was no doubt. It was Vincent. His hand lingered a little too intimately on the small of her back as they walked toward a sleek black car. I followed. They drove straight to the Del Meridian Hotel. I parked outside and waited. An hour passed, then another. And in that time, something inside me shifted. The doubt faded, leaving only crystal clear certainty about what needed to happen next. Oddly enough, I didn't feel rage. Maybe I should have. Maybe fury would have been the natural response. But instead, I was filled with something far heavier. Sorrow. I wasn't just mourning her betrayal, I was mourning my own naivete. How long had I ignored the signs? How much of our marriage had been real? And how much had been a carefully constructed illusion? As I drove home alone that night, a quiet realization settled over me. Laurel had underestimated me. She believed I was clueless, or at the very least, so trusting that I would never question her deeply enough to uncover the truth. She never would have imagined that behind my calm exterior, I was already plotting my exit, with surgical precision. If I could design an entire apartment complex from the foundation to the rooftop, then I could certainly plan the controlled demolition of my failed marriage. For the next few weeks, I played my role to perfection. Morning coffee together, casual goodbye kisses, thoughtful messages inquiring about her schedule. When she told me she'd be working late, I didn't question it. I stopped asking questions altogether. Instead, I focused on dismantling the life we had built, brick by brick. The first step was financial separation. I opened accounts at another bank, gradually transferring my share of the savings and redirecting my salary to the new account. Piece by piece, I severed the financial ties that bound us. Next, I cataloged our assets, separating what each of us had brought into the marriage from what we had acquired together. Then I sought legal counsel. Mariana, a divorce lawyer recommended by a colleague, examined the evidence I had gathered. After skimming through the documents, she looked up and said, "This is exhaustive. Most people come to me emotional and disorganized. You've practically done my job for me." I allowed myself a small inner smile. As a good architect, I replied, "Details matter." She nodded, then asked, "What exactly do you want from the divorce?" I had already thought about this. "I want a clean break," I said. "No alimony, no drawn-out battle, just an exit with the least possible damage." Her eyes flicked back to the incriminating messages and records. "Given the evidence of infidelity, do you plan to use this as leverage?" I had considered that. Not immediately, but I wanted the option. With my legal foundation secured, I turned to logistics. I found a furnished apartment across the city and paid 3 months' rent in advance. Then, I began sorting through my belongings, identifying what was truly mine and what we had acquired together. Only the essentials. Only the irreplaceable. Quietly, I packed them away, one box at a time. Under the pretext of archiving old projects, I arranged for a moving company. My excuse was simple. Home renovations would require me to work remotely. It was the perfect cover. Quietly, I closed pending matters, paid outstanding bills, and updated my mailing address. Every move was calculated, ensuring nothing disrupted the illusion of normalcy I maintained in front of Laurel. At home, I listened to her talk about work, nodding at the right moments while mentally cataloging the inconsistencies in her stories. During dinner, I noticed the way she checked her phone under the table, her lips curling into a secret smile, one that was never meant for me. At night, lying beside her, I stared at the ceiling, wondering, did she ever feel remorse? Was there even a flicker of guilt when she looked at me? The most unsettling part was that, on rare occasions, it felt like nothing had changed. She would laugh at my jokes, and we'd slip into easy conversations about a book or a movie. For a fleeting moment, the weight of betrayal faded, replaced by the ghost of what we once had. And then her phone would vibrate. Or she would suddenly remember some vague obligation. The illusion shattered, reinforcing my decision. The final, and most painful, step was revealing the truth to those who mattered. I didn't want a public spectacle, but I knew I needed a support system for when everything collapsed. I confided in only 4 people: my brother Michael, my closest friend, Hector, my therapist, and my father. My father's reaction, an honorable man, a retired judge who had spent his life upholding justice, was the one that affected me the most. As I laid out the evidence, my father's expression grew increasingly grim. When I finished, he let out a heavy sigh and said, "I'm sorry, son. No one deserves to suffer this kind of betrayal." After a brief pause, he added, "Your mother and I always thought Laurel was ambitious, but we never imagined anything like this." I nodded. I didn't expect it either. What's your plan? I explained my exit strategy in detail. He listened intently, nodding occasionally before commenting. Clean. No drama. No chance for manipulation. She made her choices, knowing full well the consequences. Then, after a long silence, he looked at me and asked, "Are you sure you can handle this? This kind of betrayal changes people." I took a deep breath before answering honestly, "I'm not okay, but I will be." The final piece fell into place when Laurel casually mentioned she had an important client dinner on Thursday night, one that would likely run late. It was perfect. Thursday would be the day. The morning arrived like any other, sunlight filtering through the blinds, Laurel's alarm ringing at 6:30 a.m., marking the start of her routine. From the bed, I watched as she meticulously chose her outfit. She slipped into a fitted burgundy dress, one I had never seen before. Feigning nonchalance, I asked, "What's the meeting about?" Everything happened with a strange serenity, until it didn't. By 2 p.m., the house still looked intact, yet the absence of my things was unmistakable. I had removed only what was mine, leaving no room for dispute. What remained was the skeleton of what we had shared: furniture, appliances, photographs I no longer wished to see. The final step was the hardest. At my desk, I wrote a short, forceful note addressed to Laurel. "Laurel, I know about Vincent. I know about the hotels, the lies, and the betrayal. I have known for weeks. I will not engage in a dramatic confrontation or public spectacle. That is not my nature. But I will not be a silent victim or a fool either. By the time you read this, the divorce papers will have already been filed. My lawyer will contact you with all the details. I have taken only what belongs to me. You will retain your dignity, something I feel you never did for me. Goodbye." I placed the note on the empty dining table, the words final and immovable. With one last glance around the hollowed-out space, I stepped outside, shutting the door on what once was. I left the note on the kitchen counter, placing a folder beside it. Copies of selected evidence. Not everything, just enough to make it clear that denial was no longer an option. With my last suitcase in hand, I stepped outside and shut the door behind me. No dramatic final look, no lingering hesitation, just an ending. As I drove away, a strange feeling washed over me. Not relief, not satisfaction, just emptiness, deep and consuming. As if I had left behind more than just furniture and photographs, as if I had abandoned an essential part of myself. 6 years of marriage, 8 years together, reduced to a note and some boxes in a moving van. That same afternoon, I settled into my new apartment, a modern, minimalist space, devoid of memories, just what I needed. Sitting on an unfamiliar sofa, surrounded by unopened boxes, I realized I hadn't cried. Not once. Would the tears ever come? My phone remained silent. I had deliberately removed the battery before leaving the house, unwilling to face the inevitable flood of messages and missed calls. Laurel's discovery could wait until morning. For one night, I wanted peace. That night, I ordered takeout from a restaurant we had never gone to together, opened a bottle of whiskey I had once reserved for a special occasion. This wasn't the celebration I had envisioned when I bought it, but somehow it felt appropriate. A toast to the closing of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. Still adjusting her dress, without even looking at me, she replied, "It's for an international cosmetics brand. Vincent thinks we have a good chance." "Vincent, isn't it?" Laurel nodded absent-mindedly, adjusting the hem of her dress. I played my part one last time, offering a small, knowing smile. "You're going to shine." For the briefest moment, something flickered across her face. Was it guilt? Doubt? But just as quickly, it vanished. "Thanks. But don't wait up. These dinners usually run late." I nodded. "No problem. I might work late too. I need to finish the Riverside blueprints." She seemed relieved, grateful not to have to invent another excuse. I stood and walked toward her, feeling strangely detached from my own body. This was it, the last time I would see her as my wife. Despite everything, the lies, the betrayals, there was a quiet mourning within me, a deep understanding of the finality of it all. I leaned in and kissed her cheek, inhaling the scent of a new expensive perfume she had never worn for me. "Have a good day." Distracted by her phone, she barely responded. The door clicked shut behind her, a soft, unassuming sound, yet it felt like the sealing of a tomb. For several minutes I sat on the edge of the bed, processing the weight of the moment. Then, with a steadying breath, I picked up my phone and set everything in motion. I messaged the movers. Everything is set. Noon. I notified my brother with a simple, "It's happening. Closing up." And I instructed my lawyer to file the necessary documents before 11:30 a.m. By the time I stood, the last of my personal belongings were packed. Our first home, purchased 3 years ago, brimming with hope and enthusiasm. Every room held echoes of a life built together. The kitchen, where we once prepared elaborate meals side by side. The living room, filled with laughter from game nights with friends. The small office, where we planned a future that, ironically, was now crumbling before my eyes. When the movers arrived, they executed my instructions with precision, carefully carrying away pieces of my life. The leather chair I had inherited from my grandfather, my collection of architecture books, the record player Laurel had gifted me on our 3rd anniversary. I slept surprisingly well, the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who had exhausted every emotion before closing his eyes. My last thought before drifting off? Had she returned yet? Had she read the note? Was she desperately trying to? Sleep took me before I could finish the thought. Then darkness enveloped me. And for a few hours everything was forgotten. The collapse came the next day, just as I had anticipated. When I turned my phone back on, it vibrated incessantly. 27 missed calls from Laurel, 43 text messages, 5 voicemails, and 12 calls from unknown numbers. Probably acquaintances trying to reach me on her behalf. I didn't bother listening to the voicemails or reading beyond the first few lines of the texts. "Christopher, please call me. This is crazy. We need to talk. You can't just disappear." One message was almost laughable in its desperation, grasping at weak justifications, trying to rewrite the truth. My response was simple, firm, unshakable. I sent a single message. All communication should go through my lawyer. Their information is in the folder I left. Then I blocked her number. The following week passed in a strange whirlwind. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects to fill the sudden void in my evenings and weekends. In my new space, I built new routines, small anchors to keep me grounded. I also stayed in regular contact with my therapist, working through the tangled grief, not just for my marriage, but for the trust I had lost in my own judgment. Later, my lawyer informed me that Laurel had tried, at first, to deny everything. She claimed I had misinterpreted harmless work meetings, a desperate attempt to rewrite reality. But when Mariana laid out the evidence, the hotel receipts, location data, and explicit messages, Laurel fell silent. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then finally she asked, "What does he want in the settlement?" My instructions to Mariana were clear: a fair division of assets, and no further contact, no mediation, no couples therapy. There was nothing left to salvage. Through my brother, I learned the impact my calculated departure had on her. I absorbed this information with mixed emotions. I hadn't planned for this to happen, but I couldn't deny the grim satisfaction curling in my chest. Actions have consequences. As an architect, I knew that a single miscalculation could bring down an entire structure. This was no different. Through various channels, I learned that both Laurel and Vincent had been placed on administrative leave. The firm, a prestigious company with high-profile clients, couldn't afford the scandal, especially when it was confirmed that corporate resources had been used to facilitate their encounters. And just like that, the foundation of their deceit began to crumble. The collapse weeks later, it was official. Both of them were fired. Vincent's wife, a partner at a major law firm, proceeded to file for divorce with such ruthless terms that it became industry gossip, fueling endless headlines. As for Laurel, once a rising star in the marketing world, she now found herself unemployed, her professional reputation in ruins. The woman who had used her charms to climb the corporate ladder had, in the end, dragged the CEO down with her. A scandal like this wouldn't just haunt her, it would define her. I had no hand in any of it. No whispers, no emails, no phone calls to colleagues. I simply watched. The natural consequences of their own choices played out exactly as they should have. And while there was a certain poetic justice in seeing how her career-first mentality had led to her professional downfall, I made a conscious effort not to dwell on it. Months after my departure, the divorce was finalized. No drawn-out battles, no complications, no lingering words. We never spoke directly again. Every message was filtered through lawyers. and we never saw each other in person. The last image I have of her is from that final morning when the last goodbye. I kissed her on the cheek as she headed to work, neither of us realizing it was our last goodbye. Sometimes I wondered, had she ever truly loved me? Or had I simply been a convenient partner, someone who supported her ambitions without asking for much in return? Had she planned to leave me once Vincent could offer her something better? Or was I nothing more than a domestic fixture, something she kept around out of habit while her real life unfolded elsewhere? The answers to these questions remained elusive, and over time, I stopped looking for them. A year after leaving our home, I stood on the balcony of my new condo, watching the city lights flicker to life as dusk settled. This space was mine, a home I had designed with my own hands. An architect finally building for himself rather than for others. Every detail reflected my vision, untouched by compromise. The open floor plan, the minimalist furniture, the floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the space in natural light. Meanwhile, the divorce was long finalized. Laurel had moved to another city, her once promising career taking a severe hit. She had joined a much smaller agency, a step back from the prestige she had once craved. And Vincent? His downfall had only just begun. Lessons in ruin. Vincent's reputation was in tatters. To settle his divorce, he was forced to part with a significant portion of his assets. At some point, any satisfaction I once felt over their downfall faded. It was no longer about revenge, just a distant reminder that consequences always catch up to those who earn them. The pain of betrayal never fully disappeared. The scars it left behind reshaped the way I moved through the world. I had become more cautious, more reserved about who I trusted. The sharp agony of those early days had dulled into an occasional ache, one that surfaced in the quiet moments, in lonely nights. But I was still rebuilding. Like architecture, human beings can collapse and be reconstructed, and in my case, each failure, each fracture had made me stronger. I would be lying if I said I never thought of Laurel. My feelings about her remained tangled and impossible to categorize. There was anger, of course, but also an odd sense of gratitude for the lessons she had forced me to learn. There was compassion, too, for someone who had traded something real for something fleeting. And sometimes, just sometimes, there was a quiet, lingering curiosity about what might have been, if only things had been different. A new foundation. The decisions had been made, the past was settled. But my thoughts were no longer trapped in what had been. I was focused on what lay ahead. A future I was designing and building for myself, one founded on self-respect rather than illusions. Perhaps love would return to my life one day, but never again with the blindness of absolute trust. As night fully descended upon the city, I stepped back into my apartment. It was empty, yet filled with possibility. Quiet, yet overflowing with authenticity and peace. 6 years of marriage had ended in betrayal and silence, but that was not the conclusion of my story. It was merely the collapse of a structure that had been compromised from within. And as an architect, I knew one undeniable truth. There is always a way to rebuild.